Now before we get to any problems about classifying numbers, let's actually look at the 6 classifications and look at how they work. So first we have natural numbers, and we use an n to show that. So for natural numbers, just consider these like your basic numbers. Stuff like 1, 2, 3, 4, just normal numbers. Nothing fancy, no decimals, no fractions, just normal. After that, it goes to whole numbers. Now, when you get to whole numbers, all you're doing is adding 0 to the group. And you'll see how I'm drawing them, they nest inside of each other. So whatever's natural is also whole, but whole is not natural. So when you get to whole numbers, all it does is add 0 to the group. Next would be integers, and we use a z for that. Now when we get to integers, we start adding in the negative numbers. So if we had 1, 2, 3, 4 with natural, when we get to integers, we add -1, -2, -3, numbers like that. So the negative numbers. Next up would be rational numbers. And we use a Q for that. Now, rational numbers, we have another category that goes with that called irrational numbers. And we use an I for that. Now, when we get to rational and irrational numbers, this is where we add in decimals. And we split it into 2 different categories based on what type of decimal it is. Now, we have 2 types of decimals that go into the Q or the rational. Terminating, so stuff like 1.25. It's terminating because it stops at 5. There's nothing else, so it terminates. So we consider that rational. The other one is repeating decimal. So like if you had 0.6 repeating, that would also be rational. It's rational because we know what it is. It goes on forever being 0.6, but we know what it is. Now, irrational, for our purposes, there's 2 types of irrational numbers. First is pi, and the square root of numbers that aren't perfect. So something like the square root of 11. So pi is irrational, and then the square root of 11 would also be irrational. Now, the overarching category that goes for all of these is R, or real numbers. So everything we're going to talk about is real. There are such things as imaginary numbers, but for our purposes in this lesson, everything will be real. So make sure you put R for everything. So you have N, W, Z, Q, I, R. So N is natural, W is whole, Z is an integer, Q is rational, I is irrational, and R is real. And the way that all these inside these little circles work is they nest inside of each other. So if something's natural, it's also whole, it's also an integer, and it's also rational, and then of course all of these are real. So what I told you in class to do was start with the lowest category it can go down to, and then work your way back out, naming all the ones as you come back out of the categories. All right, so let's look at some problems and see what this looks like. All right, so I have us 5 problems here, 5 numbers that we're going to classify. So let's start off with the first one, 6,425. So you'll notice here there's no decimals, there's no negative on it, there's nothing fancy. So we would just call this a natural number. So we start off with N. But remember, those classifications or those sets nest inside of each other. So if it's natural, it's also whole, it's also an integer, it's also rational, and all of these are real. So we'd call that an NWZQR. Next, we look at the square root of 7. So with square roots, you take the square root of the number to see if it's a perfect square or not. If it's not a perfect square, it's immediately irrational. And we know that 7 is not a perfect square, so we would call this irrational, which is I. We would still put R on it because all of these numbers are real. Next is 0. Now remember, with whole numbers, we start adding in the 0. So 0 wouldn't start until whole numbers. So we'd call this a W for whole, Z for integer, Q for rational, and then R for real. So it would be a WZQR. Next, we have negative 31.8. So we have 2 things going on here. We have a negative and we have a decimal. Now remember, the decimal is more important than the negative. Negatives start at Z, but decimals are either a Q or an I. So you can't do the negative here. Don't worry about the negative here. The decimal is what's important. And since this is a terminating decimal, it stops at 8, we would call this a rational decimal, and it would also be real. Finally, we have a fraction, 12/3. Now, when I went through all those classifications, you didn't see anything about a fraction in there. So the first thing you have to do is divide 12 by 3. 12 divided by 3 would be 4. And so then you would classify 4. And just like over here with 6,425, 4 is just a regular number, so it would be an N, W, Z, Q, R. All right, so that's how you classify numbers. If you have any questions, send me a message on Remind. Next up, we'll look at simplifying expressions.